Hello and welcome to this IFG live event on how to make a success of COP26. My name's Tom Sass. I'm an Associate Director at the Institute for Government and I lead our work on net zero. So the COP26 summit, after much anticipation, is almost upon us in just 2.5 weeks. World leaders, and we wait eagerly to see exactly who, will gather in Glasgow for this really important meeting. Of course, there's been a huge amount of progress in the last year since this summit was originally due to happen. We've seen big changes in the US's position, of course, announcements from China, announcements from many other countries, including South Africa quite recently. There is, of course, still an awful amount still to do. By most analysis, we're still quite a way off closing the gap that was first identified in Paris 6 years ago. There's many other areas where progress is needed, whether that's carbon markets, aid to poorer countries, or indeed financial reporting on how companies declare their emissions. Alok Sharma, the COP president, was out on the airwaves yesterday just asking G20 countries to step up and really calling for this to be the moment where action is needed. So what is needed to ensure that we get to an ambitious agreement? What's achievable and what does the UK need to do to secure that? And what are businesses and investors looking for from COP26 to help drive this transition? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by a really great panel to discuss all of that. First, we have Allegra Stratton. Allegra is the Prime Minister's spokesperson for COP26. She's been leading the government's messaging and helping to explain the government's climate agenda to different audiences. And will be able to provide us a bit of an inside view of the government's approach to chairing this crucial summit. And of course, before joining the government, she was a well-known journalist at the BBC and ITV. Next up, we have Emma Howard-Boyd. Emma's chair of the Environment Agency, interim chair of the Green Finance Institute, board member at DEFRA, advisor to the Board of Trade, and UN Global Ambassador for the Race to Zero and Race to Resilience ahead of COP26. And Adapt or Die was the wonderfully crisp message Emma offered in a report from the Environment Agency that was published just this morning. So we look forward to hearing about that aspect of these negotiations. Simon Eaves is CEO for Accenture in the UK and Ireland. He's a member of Accenture's Global Management Committee and was previously Chief Strategy Officer responsible for the company's strategy and investments. And James Close is head of the Climate Centre of Excellence and Environment at NatWest Group. He spent a career working at the interface of the public and private sectors on how to mobilise finance, and he was previously Director of Climate Change at the World Bank and also worked at the Treasury. A little bit of housekeeping. So this event is obviously live and on the record. A recording will be on our website tomorrow. Please do start sending your questions in now. You can use the button at the bottom of your screen to do that. Keep them brief. Please ensure that they are in fact questions. If you see someone else's question that you like, please upvote that rather than repeating it. We'll be tweeting the event out from the account IFG Events using the hashtag IFG COP26. And I'd like to thank very much Accenture for sponsoring the event. So Allegra, I'm going to start with you. Very simply, what needs to be agreed at COP26 for it to be a success?
And I unmute myself. And first, thanks for having me, everyone. First of all, I am sorry I don't have the same backing. I've rushed here. I wish I had your backing. It looks summery and sunny, just like it is outside. So for COP26 to be a success, it's quite simple. We need to get to the end of COP26 and for everyone to feel that 1.5 has been kept alive. So what that means is that the judgment is it is possible to limit temperature increase to 1.5. And to get there, we need to have demonstrated momentum and real progress on coal, cars, cash and trees. On coal, we want rich nations to phase out domestic use of coal by 2030 and for developing ones to have a bit more time, 2040. On cars, we are asking markets and manufacturers to move to the same kind of diesel and petrol phase out date that we have. We have 2030, but the expectation and hope is 2035. Cash is the $100 billion annual pot that was promised to developing vulnerable nations in 2009 at a Copenhagen COP that I was at, and I think James was at, and maybe others were at, and we can maybe talk about that in a greater detail in a second. And then trees, we want to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030 as well. The reason that these buckets matter is that if you can make real progress in those areas, and by the way, we've already seen progress in the time that we've been presidency, but we'll come on to that later, you will bring around carbon reductions, PDQ, and it will actually begin to make real progress for that 2030 date that the science since Paris has told us is so important. This is one of the things that has changed since the Paris Agreement, that 2030 date has gone up in people's priorities.
Yeah. And tell us a bit about the sort of atmosphere or the mood within the UK team. This has been a huge effort, negotiating all around the world, many months of work. We see, Alok in his speech yesterday, really sort of starting to call countries out, potentially, talking about how difficult this is going to be over the next couple of weeks and at the conference itself. I mean, what's the sort of mood in the camp, as it were?
Well, as you say, Alok made that important speech yesterday, and I take my lead from his tone and his central point, which you will all know about, which is that if we do not see more of these NDCs, sorry for the jargon, but everyone's going to have to get at lexicon and get used to these acronyms. NDCs mean nationally determined contribution. They're essentially their nearer term plans. And if we do not see more NDCs from more of the G20, then we will not be getting the real world changes that we need in order to keep 1.5 alive. So we need more progress. At the moment, all of the NDCs that we do have amount to temperature of 2.7. So it is quite clear that we need more ambition, and that is Alok Sharma's part of his role. People may or may not know that the UK, that any presidency has a role to be the convener and a fair broker to every country involved, but also has a job to drive ambition. So it's a kind of double hatting of, on the one hand, being friends and trusted and talking to everybody. On the other hand, cajoling and pushing and encouraging countries to go as far as they can. And right now, Alok has said, we do not have the ambition and the commitments we need from all of the G20. The G20 is so important because it's the lion's share, is 80% of global emissions. So, but we have had, reasons to be optimistic. South Africa came forward recently in the last couple of weeks with an encouraging NDC. The reason why that is such an important example for all of us in the working for Alok and the Prime Minister is that it is a country that has been reliant on coal, has many jobs. Many people in South Africa rely, and this is the thing no one forgets, but sometimes can be lost in the kind of discussion of the acronyms and the sort of macro economy look. But fundamentally, people do work in coal industry around the world and are wanting to know what new jobs they would get. But South Africa is working with Alok's presidency to be ambitious. So South Africa was encouraging. We obviously had the movement from Turkey that they wanted. They hadn't signed up to Paris, and now they will. So we have had reasons to be optimistic.
You will have seen Ed Miliband's been out on the attack this morning, particularly on the sort of role of the Prime Minister in this. What do you see? I mean, as the official spokesman, what is Boris Johnson's role in this conference, and what can we expect from him in the coming weeks?
He's driving ambition as well. I mean, he's on the phone, as I think you all know. He spoke to Modi. He's pushing each country in some of the ways I've just been outlining for you, to think about how they make these transitions to lower carbon tech, and showing what Britain has done, how we have been fastest to decarbonize our economy of major economies, that we have had this huge success with coal, for instance. So in 2012, 40% of our power generation was from coal. Now it's 1.5%, and we won't be using any come 2024. So not just saying, you know, cajoling, but actually proving that it's possible, and proving that that the price of some of these renewables has gone down hugely, and encouraging them. The sort of language we use is leapfrog. But essentially, I mean, James and others will be much more illuminating on this. But essentially, that this tech is fast going to be obsolete, and you want to pile in big time to lower carbon tech, because that's where the rest of the world will be eventually.
And just finally, before bringing in the rest of the panel, what can we expect at the conference in Glasgow itself? You know, this is going to be quite a different sort of look and feel to some of those previous conferences you mentioned. You know, it's going to be smaller, perhaps sort of less of a range of different groups there. What have you got planned?
Well, okay, where to start? I mean, it's going to be large. You say smaller, but I think we're expecting it to be very complex. So there's a number of ways that I can try and paint some pictures for you. The first is that there's the formal completion of the Paris Agreement. So there will be the negotiations going on around that. So that's the technical thrust of what will happen. But then, as I say, there'll be these drives and all these different buckets on coal, cars, cash and trees. I've said it a lot now. And to that end, first couple of days, I think you all might know this, but for those that don't, the first couple of days will be the World Leaders Summit, where we have over 120 world leaders who'll come together, and there will be events within that where they will be talking about the technology of the future and the kind of relationships and partnerships that we all need to make right agenda to point out what's the PM's role in this. But his role at the World Leaders Summit will be to push. And then we have a series of theme days. It's Energy Day, it's Finance Day on Wednesday, it's Energy Day on Thursday. There will be a Youth Day on Friday. There's another Nature Day on the Saturday, Sunday rest. I could go on. Anyway, so you will have theme days throughout. So in tandem with that negotiation being completed and the very complex work that our negotiators have been doing for quite a while now, you'll also have these themes and particular areas where we think if we can make progress at COP, if we can get more and more countries signed up, more momentum, we can be bringing down carbon emissions very quickly.
Brilliant. Emma, I mentioned in the intro that report which you've at the Environment Agency put out this morning, and of course, you know, we spend so much time talking about the mitigation side of this discussion. And adaptation sometimes gets sort of pushed out. Do you think, you know, under the sort of COP26 banner, there's enough going on resilience, adaptation, and preparing for climate shocks?
Thanks for the question. Great to be here, and also great to hear Allegra talk about coal, cars, cash and trees. Something that I have distinctly in my memory is back in December 2015, when I was at the Paris COP, when the Paris COP agreement was being signed at COP21, and I was part of a UK finance delegation calling for the transition to a low carbon economy. And I had to leave the negotiating hall because I was receiving a briefing from an Environment Agency colleague about flooding in Carlisle. Incidentally, our chief executive is there today opening a new flood scheme, so showing that real action is taking place on this agenda. And when floods threaten, we advise people to prepare, act and survive. The climate crisis is global, but its impacts are in your village, your shop and your home. And we've got to make sure that communities feel that the gap between what gets discussed at global conferences and the lived experience of climate impacts, if it's too wide, that compact allowing leaders to make vast commitments on people's behalf could rupture. So I'm really pleased to see the UK government is focusing on two goals, in particular the net zero goal, net zero by mid-century and keeping 1.5 degrees alive, and also focusing on adapting to protect communities and natural habitats. This does give adaptation its due, but the world's thinking has to change faster than the climate. And the global community, in my view, is currently still neglecting adaptation. So we need our leaders to step up. And today, the Environment Agency, you've mentioned this report, it's our third report to ministers under the Climate Change Act about how we are helping England prepare for climate impacts. This year, we completed the government's 6-year capital programme on time and on budget, enhancing flood protection to over 300,000 homes. And we've started the next 5-year programme, that's £5.2 billion of flood programme. And our national flood strategy out to 2100 was recently praised by the Committee on Climate Change for commitments to nature-based solutions. So as we prepare for floods, we must also prepare for drought. And the Environment Agency has made 320 abstraction licenses more sustainable, returning 47 billion litres of water to the environment, equivalent to supplying over 850,000 people water every year. So that's the flood and the drought agenda. But the Environment Agency alone cannot protect everyone from climate disruption. It's a whole society effort. So what we're doing in this country has to be repeated around the world. It's cheaper to invest early in climate resilience than to live with the costs of inaction. And the city is a global leader in green finance. But we need adaptation to be integral to government, businesses, and communities. People will soon question why it isn't. And while mitigation might save the planet, it is adaptation and resilience that will save millions of lives and livelihoods. Choosing one over the other is like telling a bird it only needs one wing to fly. So that's where I am keen to see progress in Glasgow. And the Monday, Allegra went through the first week, Monday is Adaptation and Resilience Day, but I am keen that adaptation and resilience features in every day, on every day, whether it's finance, whether it's energy, whether it's cities, whether it's nature. It is core to our entire approach at the COP discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. That's really helpful. I just wonder, this current sort of gas crisis and wider sort of supply crisis that we're having at the moment, how does that feed into your thinking about resilience? Because clearly, actually, this transition, particularly if we look at it globally, there's going to be an awful lot of sort of questions about energy demand and how different countries sort of get what they need. Is that sort of this context that we're in at the moment actually influencing your thinking as you look ahead to this conference?
Of course it will. The whole resilience agenda that we've seen over the last year, 18 months with the pandemic, preparing at not just at a national level, but at a regional level, will help inform our thinking for the climate emergency. And I think one of the areas where we can see progress is moving from, and this isn't my phrase, there's a resilience commission that's looked at moving from just in time to just in case. And I think this longer term thinking, knowing the shocks that we are starting to see happen ever bigger around the world, means that we need to plan. It's not just governments. My background is the investment world. It is businesses and it is investors too. And I think that's where we're going to see, fingers crossed, some really exciting announcements made in Glasgow, where businesses and investors, cities and others around the world are stepping up to look not just at reducing emissions, but building resilience into the way they're doing business. Thank you.
And just while I've got you, Emma, I'm going to actually bring in a really interesting question that we've got from Tony Diver from the Daily Telegraph. So he mentions the Environment Bill and says the government's obviously not yet managed to pass the Environment Bill, which enters ping pong next week after lots of amendments in the Lords. And he asks, do you think it will pass before the COP, as was always Boris Johnson's ambition?
I think that remains the ambition. I think it's over to those who introduce these laws to make sure that that happens. Thank you.
There you go. Very good answer. OK, I'll turn to James now. James, what do you think investors want to see agreed at COP26?
Yeah, thank you, Tom, and hello, everybody. I think it's worth just remembering that in the Paris Agreement, Article 2.1c is that all financial flows should be consistent with the Paris Agreement, the objectives of the Paris Agreement, and also sustainable development. So it is an anchor point that finance needs to flow for this transition from the Paris Agreement. I think what's really important is to signal that we are serious about the level of ambition that's required to shift the economy away from coal and fossil fuels towards a renewable future. And I think that's really where the nationally determined contributions sit, because that enables us as a bank and asset owners and fund managers to plan to support the transition, which is what we're doing here at NatWest. We've declared just today our target of 100 billion of climate and sustainable finance and funding by 2025 from now, and that's a significant increase on the previous target that we had. And I think, to Emma's point, we'll see lots of this ambition and mobilization of finance coming towards the delivery of the goals of the Paris Agreement. So the level of ambition and the NDCs are really central to all of this. We're very lucky in the UK that we have a high level of ambition and a very clear pathway towards net zero. You know, the policy certainty that underpins that ambition is also an important signal for us as bankers and financiers. And we're looking for that policy clarity that will enable us to mobilize our funding for things like residential retrofit and green homes, making the UK's building stock much more climate smart and low carbon, and also, to Emma's point, resilient to the existing temperature rises that we've got embedded. You know, promoting electric vehicles as well is something that is going to be very important. If we get the charging infrastructure rolled out, that will take away range anxiety and people will be able to go out and buy those electric vehicles. And if they buy them with the right financing, they can convert an annual operating cost into a combination of a lower operating cost, because electric vehicles are much cheaper to run, with the financing that comes from buying the car outright, and the total cost will be less than that of the internal combustion engine vehicles that we're driving around today. I think the other thing that's really important, and I think you're going to hear a lot about in Glasgow, is the alignment between asset owners, asset managers and bankers. And this is brought together in the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which has got, I think, about $90 trillion of finance associated with it, and hoping to be 100 trillion by the time we get to the COP. And I think that's a really good way of showing how banks, asset owners and fund managers can align to make sure that this money is flowing towards the transition, both in terms of replacing coal with renewables, but also, to Emma's point, building resilience and helping the economy adapt through much higher quality and more resilient infrastructure that's going to be required over the course of the next 30 years to support the growth that we need and the opportunity for people to feel part of this transition and see the benefits that it brings, not just from a climate perspective, but also from a health and security perspective as well.
Thanks, James. Just to pick up a couple of points there. So we hear a lot about this 100 billion figure of sort of, you know, commitment from wealthier countries towards helping other countries to adapt to climate change, to mitigate climate change. That, of course, came from the Paris Agreement, where, you know, you sort of been to these previous summits, but was not quite sort of honoured, or, you know, it wasn't clear that it was quite reached. And there's a big refocus there around this being an issue of trust, actually, at this conference to re-establish that. Do you think there's sort of sufficient progress being made on that aspect of the kind of, you know, government's commitment to financing this?
Well, I think it was very helpful to see the US double its pledge for climate funding, and that helps to close the gap. I think it's really important now to go around and look at developed countries that are perhaps a little slower in giving and committing their money as a proportion of their GDP, and make sure that money is forthcoming. And I think it really is a matter of trust, Tom, between developed and developing countries, which is why it's such an important part of making COP26 a success. I think there's an expectation that we will get to that 100 billion number, to sufficient confidence for everybody to feel as though we're there. I mean, there will always be debate about what's included and what's not included, ahead of COP. And I think that will, if we can do that, that will set the tone for a really constructive dialogue that Allegra alluded to, and that the UK can lead. But it is really, really important. And I think it's also important that that money is not just for mitigation, but is also for adaptation and resilience. And to Emma's point, if we think we've got problems in the UK, just imagine what it's like being a Pacific island where this is really existential for you.
And I wanted to ask you on one more point, which I might also bring Simon in on later, which was around reporting requirements. So this is a sort of niche, sort of nerdy area, but actually really, really important if you look at, sort of what is going to drive change through investment and businesses. And at the moment, we have quite a sort of range of different requirements. Maybe they don't all necessarily quite have teeth, or the sort of, what are you looking for from COP26 in terms of that discussion?
Well, I think we've got the architectures in place. I mean, TCFD, of course, the Task Force for Climate Finance Related Disclosure is a fundamental pillar of all of that. And for banks and financial institutions and businesses as a whole, I think that the more that's adopted, the easier it is to get a common view of where the risks lie and what we can do about them. I think there will also be some really useful material through GFANs on, for example, the Working Group 3, just to be even more nerdy, around the real economy transitions that are taking place, that can kind of codify all of those various approaches and try and bring them together in a way that maximizes convergence and reduces the costs of doing all of this. So it's not going to happen overnight, but there are some really good signals that we are getting to some consistency around some of these reporting standards, and certainly some of the best in class ones are really quite effective, I think, in communicating what's being done.
Great. Simon, turn to you now. What do businesses, I mean, like yours, but also the very many that you work with, want to see agreed at the COP?
Thanks, Tom, and great to be here. If I may, sort of three, I think, which would be fairly common view, and then maybe three further points. I think the first one plays to what Allegra introduced. Business would want a reassertion of 1.5 degrees. I think it's behind the 10-point plan, which is an excellent list of the sort of things we should get behind. And a reaffirmation of that and a commitment is massively important. That's one. I think secondly, the IEA report today, which talks to a required tripling of spending in renewables, is fundamentally important, particularly when we've just gone through the recent price shocks associated with gas. That starts to impact investment plans. So stability around supply of renewables is going to be massive for businesses to see. And I think the third one is it's very clear that this requires cooperation, public and private. A whole new level of cooperation for the next generations, which we need to see, and frameworks which support that are incredibly important. Then if I go to sort of three more maybe nuanced or different factors, just to put some thoughts down. To your last question, we see the variability of adoption of standards as an issue, because I think Allegra mentioned that technology is going to play a key role in this: data, transparency, comfort about greenwashing, etc. And data standards consistently to back this. If we think about it, accounting standards have been around for a period of time, but actually sustainability standards are hard to get our mind around. It's taken time. And I do believe that's a big blocker to the use of technology and the use of data, which combined with human skills is going to be the answer to this. And that is, I think, a big deal and next agenda item, which was described as nerdy, but is really quite fundamental in our belief. Second, and some colleagues may not accept this, I think business needs a kick, right? We've just done a survey of the 1,000 top companies in Europe, and from what we've seen, only a third have committed to net zero by 2050. Interestingly, 37% of the UK proportion have, but of those, only about 1 in 20 look like they're on track to achieve their target. Now, that could be some of the variabilities, availability, etc. But currently, our view is that people in business aren't yet on track to their commitments, and their commitments to 2050, which generally is quite slow. So, there's the carrot and the stick, which I think also needs to be applied here to business, because some plans are just not aggressive enough in our view. And then, thirdly, playing to point 9 in the 10-point plan and where Emma's pushing, we believe biodiversity needs to have a much clearer seat at the table. It's kind of one of many as opposed to being fundamental. And I say this for a couple of reasons. One, I think we need to shift consumer appetite and find consumer agency in the solution. It's really important, massively important to move consumers. And I think they significantly access biodiversity more than nebulous topics like climate movement claims, right? And so it's massively important, I think, for the biodiversity topic to raise up. And secondly, per what Emma said yesterday, the increasing evidence of the requirements of sequestration of carbon, reforestation, to soil depth, to stem flooding, all of these factors are just coming back to the fact that nature's a massive part of the solution to the challenge, and we're only just getting our mind around it. So those would be where we're at. I think there's three basics of business, but I think standards, some challenge to business and raising biodiversity's importance, those are, I think, things we need to get onto the next wave. That'd be our view.
Really interested in your point around your survey there, and obviously we do see a lot from business in terms of sort of bringing forward commitments, trying to sort of look like they're doing things, but as you say, a much more of a challenge to actually drive that change through their supply chains in a sort of in a rigorous way. You mentioned a couple of the tools for achieving that, things like reporting standards. I mean, do you think there's anything else that's needed? Is it stronger regulation from government? Is there more of a sense of how we can sort of help consumers to identify who's genuine about this and actually who's doing a bit of greenwashing and trying to appear that they are?
Well, I think the standards debate fits with holding companies to account, but also consumer access. I mean, if you just recently looked at, Oatly milk just started to publish its CO2 on its packaging. Not so long back, it wasn't there, and now that will start to become a standard. Interestingly, it's driving their differentiation. So consumer standards are as important, I think, as business standards and clarity, because those consumer movements we saw in COVID can be absolutely massive. Then your other point on the sort of movements, it's going to be tricky because businesses need to move transactional supply chains to collaborative supply chains. We've developed over an extended period of time by friction costs within supply chains globally. And now the only way to solve this is to collaborate differently. The fashion industry can't solve some of its challenges without sorting out and working very, very differently with some of its supply side. And for example, in the Get Nature Positive handbook that we just co-authored with the Council for Sustainable Business, one of the massive effects of that is the dyes in the system and the effect on the environment, not just the labor. So the next challenge there, Tom, is how we get businesses to be prepared to work across collaboratively and reinvent their supply chains is a massive deal if we're going to move beyond the basics of scope 1 and 2 and really get into scope 3. That's the other challenge.
Fantastic, thank you. Going to start turning to audience questions now, and Allegra, I've got one I'm going to start with you on, but Emma, I might bring you in as well. So from Mike Rowell, who asks, what are the COP26 team or the government more widely doing to engage directly with citizens regarding the causes and prevention of the climate crisis? I wonder if you'd be happy to pick that one up, Allegra.
Yeah, sure, big one. We are in particular, what I've been involved in the time that I've been working with Alok and the team is we do civil society outreach, and we talk to people not just from the United Kingdom, but youth activists and different communities from around the world. I think it's once a month, and it's quite a long session. And we're trying. Alok has said it repeatedly. We do want this to be the most inclusive COP. And I think the fundamental reason for that is that, and this might take people who are not familiar with COPs, it might take, it's a brilliantly simple concept, but it does take some getting used to. COP will only work if everybody agrees. It is that simple. It is, and that's why you saw at Paris, vulnerable nations threatened to walk out, and that was a significant problem. So to that end, Alok is clear that everybody needs to be feeding in and feeling and actually being listened to all the way along, so that the COP principles, the principles he is applying as he goes about being COP president, but also what ends up coming out at the end is something that has reflected as many views as possible. But it is a tough gig. It's really, really hard. But Alok speaks to as many of the representative friends of COP group as well, but in particular that civil society and youth piece, to make sure that their views are being reflected early enough on, because if they say come COP that it hasn't worked for them, that will be a problem. And
Emma, is that sort of citizen engagement element also quite a big factor in your plans around resilience, climate adaptation, and so on? And if so, can you sort of give some details about how exactly you'd go about it?
It's hugely important to the adaptation and resilience agenda. It's important what I see at the Environment Agency, being out in communities. I was out in Mythen Roy, the Calder Valley, the other day, opening a flood scheme where we work directly with the local community, who become flood wardens, who become the first line of defence as we see these events take place. But in my global role as well, it was very clear. I was part of the Global Commission on Adaptation, the role of local adaptation, that sense that this is a global issue, but the way you need to respond to climate change is very local, very much in your community. And just this morning, I was taking part in a call with those ambassadors to the races to zero and resilience. I focus on the resilience side. I think net zero is incredibly important, but I'm really keen to be channeling views from the local adaptation work, the local adapters, as we're now referring them to COP, because some of them won't be able to get there. And hearing from what people are doing in Bangladesh, in India, in parts of Africa is so vital to the outcomes that we are successful at COP, this COP and future COPs. So it's really tough. I know the COP team have also involved David Attenborough to be the people's spokesperson. And I think he is traveling slowly to Glasgow to talk to as many different people en route so that he really feels that he is representing citizens. And the work of assemblies in this country, but around the world, I know there will be a lot of leaders turning up in Glasgow who have come with that knowledge of what the citizen wants from this agenda. Thank you.
James or Simon, did you want to come back on that, or shall I go to another question? No. Okay. So we've got a couple of questions here, quite difficult questions, I would say, on the international element of the negotiations at COP26. So I might come first to Allegra and then perhaps to James on these. So the first is it fair or realistic to expect developing nations to quickly decarbonize when the developed world has benefited from historic industrialization? So this is a very familiar element of these negotiations. And then the second one from Tony Sudworth is more topical. He asks, is the expansion of China's coal-fired power stations in light of their power issues a real blocker at this stage? Allegra, could I start with you on those, and then James, I might come to you.
I suppose it's the same sort of answer to both questions, which is to bring in the South Africa example again. The point that has been emphasised is that the shift to renewables and to a range of different energy sources will ultimately be better for South Africans, will yield jobs too, but will also be a lower carbon and therefore better for all of their populations. I mean, that's the thing that you sort of is not a kind of particularly wonky point, but it's something that it's worth reminding yourself of. You know, in all of these countries, there are issues of air pollution, there are issues of, you know, kerosene lamps that get knocked over and are a fire hazard and are a health hazard. So, but to go back, you know, it fundamentally is about encouraging people through a range of alliances as well, sharing knowledge of the technology, sharing knowledge of how you would implement this technology, how you would invest, and so on. Fundamentally, it's about seeing these coal-fired power stations as stranded assets. This idea that you might pile in tomorrow, but you might regret it really quite quickly, at which point, and I know I've said it before, but you know, this is an economic as well as an environmental decision that we're trying to encourage and support other countries to take. Just on the China point, you know, I'm sure most people on this call know this, but UNGA saw China move to end its international financing of coal power, coming on the heels of Japan and South Korea doing that earlier in the year around the time of the G7. This eliminates the funding for 90% of international coal. So there is progress. You know, this is about momentum building, and we have already seen it on coal. And for me, the most powerful thing is listening to Antonio Guterres of the UN, who says, you know, you want to get a 1.5 just get rid of coal. So, you know, now clearly this is, I don't want to be too flippant about it, because it is about keeping the lights on in these countries. But nonetheless, you look at South Africa and you look at the movement that's happened from the Chinese on international financing, and it is progress.
That's a really important point on the kind of, you know, the facts on what really is happening. I just actually, Allegra, wanted to ask you on one point, because I know you've been thinking about how the government explains the need for domestic action to different audiences here in the UK. Yeah. And there were some really interesting sort of focus groups around the Conservative Party conference, and they were sort of looking at this issue of climate change and gas boilers and so on. And quite often this issue of, well, China's not doing anything, China's building coal plants was coming up. Is that something you're thinking about in terms of how you actually explain what's going on around the world to justify what we're doing here?
We do hear that point being made, but fundamentally, I always feel that there is an advantage to being the first mover. And so if we can be pioneers in the technology, that will mean jobs. And that will mean jobs mean improvement for communities, and horizons being extended, and international travel for our young people who've got these skills in, you know, engineering, wind turbines, climbing up to the top, and out at sea in terrible weather, and they can take those skills around the world. So fundamentally, I see it as a first mover advantage, We've already got a proven track record in this area that we should be really proud of. The point that comes through to all of us about the focus groups again and again, and it's a very similar finding, is that fundamentally this is now in the top 3 of their concerns, and it's quite similar across many demographics. And people see it as a very, I think somebody said it earlier in this session, and it's true, that it's a very simple connection. I think Simon said it, it's a simple connection with the natural world, and people feel that their lives and their communities are out of balance, and they would like that to be addressed.
Yeah. James, I wonder if I could bring you in there, sort of drawing perhaps on your experience at the World Bank as well, and your sort of experience in these negotiations in the past. I mean, do you think we are doing enough to provide a sort of pathway, a kind of fair, reasonable pathway for lower income countries?
Well, I think the answer to that question is we need to do more. And I think the narrative around it, which I thought the Carbon Trucker Initiative really described very well, is we've got to turn this into a conversation about the gain that comes from decarbonising and the benefit that's going to bring, rather than the pain that comes from shifting away from fossil fuels. And I think what we've seen is the change of the economics. So almost everywhere in the world, renewables are cheaper than new fossil fuel energy investment. And the most compelling piece of work we did at the World Bank around this was around decarbonising development. And it was really getting people to think about the destination, not the first step. And if you think about what your economy is going to look like in 2030 or 2050, you do different things than if you think about how you're going to provide heat and light tomorrow. And I think that's where the help's required, to build up capacity in countries to help them make those decisions, to embed them in NDCs, and then to provide the financing to enable that to happen. And I think in developed economies, what we can do is we can invest in the big shifts that are required for the next generation of technologies, whether that's carbon capture, usage and storage, or whether it's battery technologies, bring down the prices, which is what we've seen for renewables, and enable emerging markets and developing countries to adopt them and finance them through the right combination of development finance and private finance. And that's really a very simple idea that came out of the Addis Ababa Development Summit ahead of Paris, which was to turn the billions into trillions. And the billions of money provided from a development finance perspective can mobilize private sector investment. And you know, that capital will be rational. It'll go to where the risk returns are appropriate. And I think that's how we get emerging markets access to the capital that they need in order to support low carbon development. And that will mean, you know, enabling them to get access to education and healthcare, making sure that we protect the natural environment. I mean, a lot of these countries have had to chop down trees because that's their primary source of income. How do you reward them for keeping the forests intact? And how do you use indigenous peoples as the protectors of those forests? And all of those issues are baked into the Paris Agreement. And the opportunity that the UK has got as the COP presidency and the role that we can all play a part of is bringing that to life through COP26 and enabling us all, as Allegra says, to collectively buy into this new vision of both development in developed countries, but also in developing countries in a way that is better for everybody and better for the planet.
Emma, oh, sorry, Simon, please come in on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to come back also to the link of the consumer, because there's clearly the 20 NDCs mentioned, but actually we've just done another survey of the global consumers post-pandemic. And interestingly, what it says is that there is almost a new consumer group that's emerged, which is about 40 to 50% of folk who are actually, we're calling the reimagined consumer. And the traditional value, just pure price quality, are still there, but there's new values which are dominating their thinking. And they are health and safety, their trust, their purpose, their product of origin. They're all the things which actually businesses would do to support the sustainability agenda. So, you know, businesses who are getting on this are actually hitting at the consumer need, and all of the countries, we believe, have a consumer movement to this reimagined consumer, where this is a true now need for them societally, but also in their buying behavior. So, you know, I think actually that consumer movement can be tremendously positive and a consistent thread globally. It is incredibly consistent. The reimagined consumer is a global phenomena, very evident here, but also elsewhere.
Really, really interesting. I was talking to a heat pump engineer just the other day who was talking about how for many people wanting to get those installed, it's not just about the product, it is indeed the emissions. Emma, I wanted to bring you in there because we've heard a couple of references to biodiversity loss, which is obviously a really critical issue here and around the world. And I wondered what your kind of top 2 or 3 points on sort of how we address that might be. And if I could, I wanted to throw you another question, which we've had from Pip Goodwin, who makes a point. We've heard a bit about trees already, but Pip makes a point that trees are a really important part of the mix, but 2/3 of the planet is ocean. So will the government be pushing for a climate smart fisheries sector? I wonder if I could get your view on both of those.
Thank you. And nature, I mean, it's fantastic to see how much biodiversity, restoration of nature has gone up the global agenda, and how much joining up we've seen between the different COP processes. So we have COP15, I think, still meeting at the moment on biodiversity, but a really strong presence of nature throughout the 2 weeks of planning for Glasgow. And really pleased, Accenture's work supporting the Council for Sustainable Business, that's another thing that I'm involved with, and the Get Nature Positive campaign is just another manifestation of how you get government and businesses and investors and consumers working together on this agenda. So some fantastic commitments coming out, fantastic calls for action led by the Prime Minister and Zach Goldsmith in particular around nature, hence the trees. I'm sure Allegra can go into the details of this. I'm not overly rehearsed on this, but that sense from our perspective at the Environment Agency that nature is so key to both the net zero agenda and the adaptation and resilience agenda. It has been really heartening to see how many of our flood projects have moved from being grey infrastructure to a real combination of green, blue and grey where it makes most sense, and seeing that take place and shift all the way around the world. The last COP had a very strong focus on oceans. And again, I know it's been key to the work of DEFRA ministers to make sure that there is a continued focus on the sea. From a vulnerable country perspective, a lot of the small island states now want to reposition themselves as the blue continent so that they're really being seen as strong and investing in their resilience, not just through land and becoming net zero, but through the oceans as well. So probably good to bring in Allegra to add to what I've just been saying. Thank you.
You okay? Comment on that, Tom?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I always like, somebody said to me, they're not small island states, they're large ocean states. I quite like that. The point is, fundamentally, 1.5 is about the ocean, because it's about the communities that if we can keep 1.5 alive, then we are the physics of this is that we keep sea levels from rising, because ultimately that's what 1.5 is there, because at Paris, the small island states or large ocean states chanted it, right? And it's incredibly potent and powerful for that reason. For them, I mean, when we were at UNGA, the Prime Minister had led the round table with other countries, and it ended up mostly being vulnerable nations. And Mia Motley of Barbados, she said, they're making these, just describing what this actually feels like when seeing sea levels rise and so on. So, and the fear and the hurricanes. She described hurricanes as the heart attacks of climate change. And from Fiji, they talked about having, I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but a very, very large number of extreme weather events back after back after back. So fundamentally, 1.5 and Alok Sharma's push for 1.5 is about life for those who live very close to the ocean, and is also about the ecosystem of the ocean. But all COPs need to have their kind of streamlined decisions and priorities, and these are the ones that Alok Sharma and the Prime Minister have chosen. And just to loop in on some of the other points that are almost themes that back each other up. On trees, there is already a declaration. It's called the New York Declaration, and it's from 2014, and this is to halt and reverse deforestation. But we are trying to make it bigger, have teeth, have money behind it, and reflect the processes that will actually stop deforestation. To your point, Simon, about the is it the reimagined consumer that right? So trying to reflect what use of deforestation within supply chains, and trying to actually push the processes to end halt and reverse deforestation by 2030, and have a greater number of countries sign up to it. So I just thought it'd be helpful to explain what we're actually pushing for, because it does speak to the points that are being raised about intelligent consumers. Yeah.
Allegra, a few more questions for you, I'm afraid, coming in from our audience. So a couple, I mentioned at the top, this issue of exactly who's going to turn up, being an always important thing at COPs. And Claire Ellicott from the Daily Mail says, will COP be a failure if President Xi of China doesn't attend? And we've got a slightly related question from Robert Morland here, who's asking, who do you expect to be the most difficult? Is it Russia, Australia, and so on?
I'm afraid I'm gonna be annoying, because I've actually lost track of how it's so close. It's it's sort of pointless counting the days now. It is upon us. It is here. We are still anticipating and hoping that we have as many big players at COP as possible, so that we drive the highest ambition, COP26, to keep 1.5 alive and to see real progress on coal, cars, cash and trees. And it wouldn't be right for me to single anyone or anything out, though I suspect, again, it will probably be vulnerable nations who like they did at Paris, are clear that they can't accept. They will drive and drive and drive until they feel that this is what they needed. No, is that being difficult, or is that what COP is about?
Completely fair enough. And I thought it was notable in Alok's speech yesterday, the kind of the G20 countries who were not named as having produced enhanced agreements. So we can all read between the lines on that one. Couple more questions, Allegra, sorry, just on the domestic progress. One from someone saying, should we have published the net zero strategy a bit sooner to have more impact? Are we still expecting that ahead of the COP? And then another one from Claire from the Daily Mail, who asks about electric car grants and the rumours that those are going to be cut, and the message that sends.
Right. Net zero strategy is coming before COP. You have had throughout the year a number of other strategies. You've already had the transport decarbonisation strategy, you've had the hydrogen strategy, and you will get before COP the heat and building strategy and the net zero strategy. You have also had over the last few years, you've had quite a number of plans and pledges around how we will bring down our carbon. First of all, it was the target to bring it down by 68% by 2030, and now it's 78% by 2035. So I think there's no shortage of activity from Whitehall and the government on our carbon plans. The next question was about EVs, and cars, they're up there, Claire. They're coal cars, cash and trees. We are clear that we have the target to phase out diesel and petrol by 2030, and we are encouraging the world to do the same, major markets, many manufacturers, by 2035. You've seen, I'm sure you know, Claire, lots of people on this call will know, the numbers are going up of people buying EVs, and in the not too distant future, we will. I think it was James that made the point earlier. When you look at EVs over their lifetime, they are lower cost to run. So the fundamentals are good, and you will see in the next few weeks ahead of COP more details.
Okay, thank you for those, and we'll
Any
give
more,
you a
Tom?
give you a rest now, and we'll give the rest of the panel a go. James and then Simon. So I've got a question here on green finance. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to come to the whole panel for closing comments after this one. But a question on green finance here from Eric Albert. So he asks, do the panelists agree that finance per se won't drive change unless governments show the way by putting in place a proper carbon price? Otherwise, brown investments will simply keep going. James, where are you on this debate around carbon pricing?
Well, as somebody from the World Bank who got carbon pricing onto the agenda in Paris, we're very keen that it's a necessary but not sufficient part of the solution. Of course, we have a carbon price. There is a carbon price in the compliance market in the UK, which is connected to the EU ETS. And we also have a carbon price emerging from the voluntary carbon markets as well. But I think what's really worth focusing on is the social cost of carbon and the work that people like Nick Stern and Joe Stiglitz did after the Paris Agreement, which focuses on the price that we need to both compensate the planet for the damage that fossil fuels are doing, but also to stimulate the investment that's required to shift away from carbon. And that's, by 2030 would be $100 a ton. By 2040, 40 to 80. So we're sort of there for some of the compliance markets, but we need to continue to go, and we need broader coverage of carbon pricing.
And do you think the politics are sort of possible on that?
Well, I thought the OECD paper on this was quite interesting and quite promising, but we'll see. I think it would help a lot if we could get ambitious carbon pricing out there.
Great. And Simon, did you want to come in on that? I mean, are businesses generally up for this sort of change to see more comprehensive carbon pricing?
I think that's a tricky answer to give, just a sort of a relevance of what might be needed, though. We recently had a session with our Accenture board with the MIT professor, John Sturman, who's developed an open source model around what variables will drive a reduction. And in that modeling, one of the biggest factors was carbon pricing. Moving. So it would indicate that part of the solution is going to need to be something of a greater sort than we currently have. And it was a big driver of change. So, yeah.
Okay. We've got about a minute left, so I'm going to come around each of the panelists. If I could just ask you very briefly, what's the kind of one thing, if I can put you on the spot, one thing after the COP that we should look out for to judge whether it has been a success? Emma, can I come to you first on that?
Real action, real stuff happening on the ground.
Okay, Allegra, come to you next.
The 1.5 is alive. The judgment is from reasonable observers that it is still possible to limit temperature increases to 1.5. I'd like to say a noun and a thing, but I think that wouldn't be right. I think it's just got to be this judgment that temperature increase will not go up above 1.5. That's what we all need.
And who are those reasonable observers? That's the sort of scientific community who will come out.
yeah, I mean, some of the people that have been name checked on this call already, you know, wise heads.
Okay, we'll look out for those. James?
Making sure the money is available to do this, and I think it will be. So let's finance the transition.
Okay, and Simon?
I'll support Allegra. The 1.5 and all the associated investment, which will now be required to do that, provides a framework for us to have a chance.
Brilliant. Well, that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much to everyone for watching at home, submitting a whole host of brilliant questions. Thank you to Accenture for sponsoring the event, and thank you most of all to my panel for engaging with all of those questions so openly. So this event will be, the recording will be on our website from tomorrow for anyone who didn't manage to catch the whole thing. Do look out for further events that we'll be doing on climate change and a report that we're putting out just ahead of the spending review on net zero and the tax system. That's all from us.